Welcome to the E-Pathshala for postgraduate students. The subject that we are discussing is architecture, the paper is urban design, and the module is the technology and urban design. Welcome to session 3. In session 1, we discussed the technology of the past, how urban design was affected by it. In session 2, we discussed essentially what the impact of technology was on urban design in a very explicit way, especially in the invention of the modern era and the impact that technology had on the understanding of cities in the modern era. In session 3, we are going to extrapolate our current and upcoming technology and look at how it would impact, how we think it would impact the city of the future. However, the nature of technology itself is something that is elusive and sublime, and it keeps changing constantly. A few of the things we will be discussing today will probably no longer be relevant in a year or two, and a few things we have never even imagined would become central to our understanding of, to our anticipation of the future in the next few years. Session 3 is called the Digital City and Beyond. Before we get into the city itself, let's look at the global problems and issues that we have that directly impact an increasingly urban planet. We've always, throughout our history, always had a concept of what tomorrow would look like. And in our past, we've always dreamed a future that was filled with either hope or dread, or a little bit of both. When we look at some of the visions of the future that emerged from the past, for example, this is from the cartoon The Jetsons. This is what the animators thought that the city would look like, with flying cars and buildings in the sky on stilts, and people zooming around throughout their environments. This is a poster from the 1930s of people with jetpacks and living in geodesic domes, and also flying and walking through pneumatic tunnels. And we come to other, perhaps mildly darker futures, like this famous poster of the Atomic City from 1942 by Frank R. Paul, which was a cover of a magazine, and these were speculations of what the city would look like in terms of large domes and conical towers. And these ideas were deeply rooted in what we discussed in session 2, which was the machine age, and this celebration and nervousness at the power that technology, or as they called it, the machine, would have on urban design. And this is a game that we still keep playing, and this is a game that we as human beings play inevitably and perhaps endlessly with what we think our future is going to look like. The reason that technology has become crucial in our understanding of the world in the last few decades is not because there is new technology, but at the speed at which this new technology is filling our lives. And this is exemplified by Gordon Moore's famous Moore's law, which predicted that the capacity of a semiconductor microprocessor would double every 10 years. We've managed to double it almost every 8 years since his famous law was propounded. This constant increase in the capacity of microprocessors to handle information, to essentially process information, has led to an increasingly fast evolution of technology, and things which are introduced today would be outdated in a year or perhaps 2 years. And the same with technology that was introduced perhaps 3 or 4 years ago. And it's this rapid evolution and this rapid cycle of birth and decline in technology that has really put this idea of technology front and center to an extent that perhaps we have never seen before. Although this celebration and fear of technology is something that comes to us and has haunted us for a very long time in the modern age. And it's the word machine, it's the word technology that has been servicing our ideas of the past and the future for many, many years now. But let's look at a few of our problems and the possibilities that technology offers within on a global scale. And all of these problems would eventually affect urban design for the simple reason that this planet is becoming increasingly urban and will most likely become urban in the next few decades, predominantly urban in the next few decades rather. The first and perhaps the most obvious and the most immediate to our world is the simple and almost inescapably enormous problem of climate change, and we are still discovering ways in which to deal with it. We're looking at rapidly changing environments. We're looking at threats to our urban to populations on a scale that is potentially disastrous, and the cities, especially the coastal cities, are going to be at the forefront of this battle against climate change. And there are a number of solutions that people have started to talk about, especially in the areas of geoengineering and climate engineering, of essentially moving past conservatism and claiming, because it may be a little bit late to take purely conservative measures, and then move on to perhaps more aggressive means like geoengineering, some of which we are discussing, the merits of which are probably best discussed in a far more scientific environment. But this is something called a space lens, propounded by Gregory Bedford, of reducing the reducing the amount of light that hits the earth. And there are similar there are also other solutions which essentially involve particulate matter, which would reflect the sun's rays back and allow only a certain percentage back into onto the earth's surface. So these ideas have various merits and demerits, and they're deeply technical, both of which are deeply technical. But the idea of climate change hanging over the city is something that is fundamental to our understanding of the future of the city, especially in the decades to come. And we are going to have to deal with this issue on a daily basis in the next few decades, and it is essential to the survival of the species. And it's also the scale of climate change that we're going to see is most likely going to devastate the hinterlands and the rural areas, and people are going to run to the only place that can offer some source of perhaps employment, like the city. And the city is going to be a kind of a refugee camp for a lot of people in the decades to come. And so this is an important consideration for urban designers in the next few decades. Another issue which is important to the planet and at the moment is peripheral to urban design is the mass extinction of species that we are seeing over and over again throughout the last few centuries. And in the last 100,000 years, we have lost more species compared to most other mass extinctions, except for one or two. This current mass extinction is mostly the direct interference of man in actively killing species or destroying their habitats. One of the famous examples is the dodo, which was a bird that was abundantly available in places like Madagascar, but which has completely disappeared purely because of human interference. This is a famous photograph of Mata, the last passenger pigeon, which died in the early 1900s. And this was an urban species. This was a species that was once the most common bird that you could see in cities, but it's now disappeared, and that's because of massive hunting as well as the disappearance of its original habitat. And these are things that directly affect us as cities and as urban populations, and we are going to have to do something about this lack of biodiversity that we're seeing. The next and perhaps more immediate threat is the threat of pandemics, and the threat that because of our increasing densities of population, as well as our increasing travel across different continents, we now see diseases spread at an incredible rate through cities, and primarily through airports and train stations and other transport hubs. These transport hubs allow cities to be carriers of immense disease, and the densities of cities allow this to happen. We have seen this increasingly in the last few years with Ebola, SARS, bird flu, swine flu, and a number of and this trend is going to have an immediate effect on cities, and it can be devastating, and cities need to deal with this problem of the threat of a pandemic fairly frequently in the next few decades, given the increasing scope and size of cities. And this will have a perhaps unforeseen effect on the design and the urban form of cities as well. There are responses to these problems which are expressed primarily through biotechnology, and which advocates a more aggressive approach rather than a pure conservational based approach. Some of these approaches are expressed in concepts of de-extinction, where a number of species which have been decimated by man are trying to find their way back through biotechnology, and there's a groundswell of scientists who are attempting to bring these species back as a way of actively bringing back the biodiversity that we as a species have destroyed ourselves. There are discussions of actually using negative connotations, negative vectors like mosquitoes which carry malaria, and actually using them as a delivery mechanism for things like vaccines, which is a wild idea, but it could be an idea that could be helpful given the fact that we could potentially inoculate and vaccinate a lot of people. And cities, given the growth of cities in the next few decades, we will have a bioagent could probably be a better delivery mechanism of vaccines and other therapies than a human to human interaction. But underlying all of this is what is known as the law of the minimum, and we are increasingly dealing with the fact that we are consuming our resources on a scale that we have never consumed them before, and that's because of our increasing populations. And what we have done is to create a situation where we have started to count our resources, and the law of the minimum, which essentially declares that the progress or the growth of any particular system is determined by the resource that's in the minimum quantity. So things like water, oil, and all of these precious resources are essentially challenging us to use them in a far wiser way than we have been in the last few centuries. There are conservative ways in which we are doing this, and this is becoming increasingly mainstream, where we talk about reducing, reusing, and recycling a lot of the materials and the waste that we produce. And we have already, people like Shigeru Ban have been speaking about this for many years. But we have to start to do this on an urban scale, and we are starting to do this on an urban scale to a certain extent. But this is a trend that is rapidly going to become not only going to be purely a choice, but it's also going to become something that has to be done almost automatically, and it was something that will probably become the default habit of most people who live in cities. and this will express itself in construction of buildings, of roads, of infrastructure and so on, and we are going to have to do this on an immense scale. An idea that has become far more important is this concept of shared cities. The city has always been a shared space, and it has always been a place where a number of people have come together and built something together. However, it has always been an environment that, even within the egalitarianism it provides, always has a certain disparity within itself, and it's a disparity that is essentially built into the diversity that it encourages. However, given the lack of resources that we are faced with, given the dangers that the city in itself is faced with, and also the increasing emphasis of the city as a preferred mode of life for our species, has led to a substantial rethinking of what would make a city far more accessible to people. And this concept of sharing not just the space of the city, but sharing the resources of a city is very crucial, since in the last few decades we have started to build, perhaps as a legacy of the functional city, we have started to build cities primarily as as areas of single uses, and the shared cities concept is essentially an exploration of how to break that sense. And this has become an increasingly popular way of dealing with the underused and underutilized resources of a city. And we see this more and more and more, where a number of people have decided to essentially find places of the city that are not perhaps as efficient as they could be, and attempting to maximize that efficiency. For example, we see this in transport, and bike sharing, which is an increasingly popular idea throughout the world, especially in Europe, is becoming a concept that is very attractive to a number of people, not just because it is easy to implement, but also because it is essentially is non-polluting. It allows people to transmit transport themselves across great distances within certain restrictions. However, when these bikes are allowed onto bigger public transport like buses and trains, that increases the range of the city in its of the traveler within the city. Now, this creates a system whereby ownership of vehicles and ownership of property of transport infrastructure within the city becomes far more perhaps democratic and far more convenient, because you no longer need to carry your cycle with you, or carry your bike with you, or carry your car with you, and it's always available somewhere close to you. And you can always carry it to a place and back. You can always ride it to a place and back, and leave your you don't need to take it beyond where it needs to go, and thereby you're creating efficiencies that no longer existed. And this plays into this broader concept of a far more efficient and usable city compared to the ones that we currently occupy. There are further ways in which to share, such as food sharing, which is becoming increasingly popular, where a particular part of the city produces food, and another part of the city produces a different kind of food, and they exchange the excess food they produce. And this is also feeding concepts such as urban agriculture, which is becoming increasingly popular, and something that is essentially exists to balance out the concrete jungle of the city, both in terms of what it produces and in terms of its environment itself. Another concept which has become popular in places like India already is this idea of shared workspace. As more and more people attempt to innovate and strike it on their own, it has made a lot of sense for them to occupy a space together and then work in both together and individually, thereby using an existing piece of infrastructure, of urban infrastructure, in a far more efficient way. This allows the city to be a hotbed of not just efficiency but also innovation, since this allows people to interact on a daily basis in a far more intimate way than they ever did before. This idea is expanded further into not just existing spaces but also to new design spaces, which is completely revolutionizing this idea of function. This is an example of a building whose function or whose use changes every day of the week. And what this does is this allows us to radically question what function means to a city and what it means to a building as such. And this would mean that the future of the city is tied not to function perhaps, but to time and the changing of function over time. And this is perhaps going to revolutionize the urban form in a way that we do not know at the moment. We are also dealing with an extremely immediate problem of a lack of petroleum, which is somewhere very close to on the horizon, somewhere very close to our current time. We are dealing with climate change because of the massive amounts of coal that we burn, and a number of other issues dealing with fossil fuels. Therefore, we have slowly started to move towards new modes of energy. There is currently research going on cold fusion, which could potentially, if successful, could be a revolutionary source of energy. But in the meantime, we are also dealing with more traditional renewable energy like geothermal, wind and solar. However, the issue with these forms of energy is that they are inherently unreliable. You need wind for a windmill to turn, you need bright sunshine for a solar plant to work, and geothermal is restricted to certain geographies in themselves. So, the fundamental issue with this unreliability needs to be addressed through essentially batteries, which store energy when there is an excess supply, release that electrical energy when there is a shortage of supply, and there is a lot of research going on essentially storing and feeding grids through batteries, and thereby increasing the reliability of these renewable resources of energy, which essentially fluctuate. And this is an example of one, but there are many more of these ideas that are floating around. And the ultimate aim is perhaps to create a zero energy city, as analogous to the zero energy building research that is currently ongoing. It is hoped that because of the economies of scale, we could ultimately move towards a city that is essentially energy self-sufficient and could answer all its requirements through production and consumption and conservation within itself, and thereby creating a self-sustaining cycle which could potentially create a far more sustainable city compared to the way in which cities operate right now. That is the end of part 1. These ideas that we have discussed throughout this session so far are predicated on the fact that these global problems have solutions that essentially need to be applied in fairly concentrated areas, such as, and most obviously, the city. And it's this ability that urban spaces have to create these problems, and to a large extent also be laboratories for these problems to be solved, is what makes the city perhaps the most engaged aspect of humanity when dealing with these issues. And most of our solutions to the problems of climate change, to the problems of resources, of lack of resources, are fundamentally created and destroyed and perhaps hopefully destroyed by the sheer creativity that cities allow, and the sheer magnitude of ideas that a city can generate. And these problems have their origins in urbanization itself, which we discussed in session 2, where we started to see the emergence of pollution, of urban pollution becoming a huge issue even at the start of the industrial revolution itself. And so, we, having created these problems as citizens of cities, as urban citizens throughout the world, we are now looking for these solutions, and we will most likely find these solutions as urban dwellers within these cities. But these ideas and these problems and these solutions all have a direct impact on urban form. For example, we are already starting to look at how to design buildings in the face of massive climatic events like the frequent cyclones that keep hitting our shores, and we're starting to design buildings with far more insulation. We're starting to use materials which are a little bit more sustainable. So, there is within the realm of architecture and within the realm of construction, there is an awareness that we need, that cities especially need to start to move towards a far more sustainable situation. However, we have yet to apply these solutions on an urban scale, but there is this awareness that it should be that these solutions will be better when applied on the scale at which we've discussed. Therefore, it is important to understand that the city itself is once again an arena for remarkable change, and also a place that is where disaster is possible, but the solutions to disaster and essentially hope is also possible. Thank you.